Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Cindy Bloom.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of July 7th, and this is your Monday briefing. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act is now a law, and we're going to be examining next steps for implementation both at the government and business levels.
This is a big week for tariffs, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's get started with the tax provisions of the Act with Chairman Dave Camp. Chairman Camp, welcome.
Thank you. Good to see you both.
So why don't we start with how you would characterize the outcome of the One Big Beautiful Bill?
Well, Sindhu, I think when you look over the past 6 months and maybe even over the past year, I would say that the result of this legislation is actually fairly business friendly. I mean, when you look at some of the revenue raisers that we were looking at and thinking about and potentially talking about as being part of the legislation, whether it was a corporate rate increase or it was a corporate SALT or whether it was repealing carried interest or whether it was a stock buyback tax, none of those things ended up in the bill. And so from that standpoint, I think pretty significant. The other important point is the three business provisions that we've been talking so much about, and some had called them the orphans, those were made permanent, whether that was, the full expensing of R&E or there's that EBITDA in terms of interest limitation or the third provision, which was the full expensing, bonus depreciation. I mean, I think those things were really important. And the fact that those were made permanent, I think are a real benefit and a real positive thing about the bill. And the fact that it was passed this early, I think will give business an opportunity to see what effect it might have in the near term on the economy.
Chairman Camp, you started by mentioning some things that are not in the bill, and one of them was the Section 899 international tax provision, which ultimately was taken out. Could you talk a little bit about what that means? Is it completely off the table, and what might we see in that space in the future?
Well, Section 899 was really a provision to address the unfair taxes that other countries were potentially enacting against the United States and against the United States companies. And there was an agreement at the G7 between Secretary Bessent and also some of the leaders of those countries that they kind of agreed to what might be called a side-by-side approach, where the U.S. would have their international tax system, and then there would be an international tax system through the OECD process. Now, there's a question about how enforceable that agreement is and what it may mean long term, but because of that, Secretary Bessent asked that that provision be dropped from the bill, and this provision did have support in both the House and the Senate, and members of Congress in the majority certainly did want that. So we'll have to see what this means because the G7 doesn't include all the countries in the inclusive framework. So I think potentially this was something that was really a negotiating tool, Section 899, clearly at the end of the day. But again, it remains to be seen how things develop. And so I don't see this legislation coming back in the near term, but is certainly one of the tools in the toolbox I could go back to maybe at some point in the distant future.
All right, I want to talk about implementation because after a piece of legislation of this size, there are a lot of steps, a lot of components when it comes to implementation. So what are the immediate next steps when we think about implementation of this act?
Well, you're right, Sindhu. These provisions all have many layers to them, and as they get dug into, there'll be questions that'll be raised. And so this really then does move to the administrative side of things, into the Treasury Department in terms of writing regulations, giving guidance on terms of what these, very specific provisions might mean as you dig deeper into them. So I think it moves away from the Congress in a sense, although Congress does, monitor what happens certainly at the Treasury Department in terms of regulation. And some of the key people that needed to be in place at Treasury are there now. And I think to some extent there was some work done before the bill passed, even at Treasury on these things. So again, it'll move to the regulatory side of the ledger, and that'll be important for companies and businesses to follow.
Chairman Camp, with regard to companies and immediate next steps, what should they be considering?
Well, I think it's going to be important for companies now that we actually know what the legislation is and what it says, that they evaluate the bill and what the impacts on certainly their business, on markets, and on the economy, and then look for potential issues that they might need to have addressed in the regulatory process.
All right, and Scott, I want to turn to you quickly, and Chairman Camp, if you have comments on this, that would be greatly appreciated. This is a big week for tariffs. So we've got a deadline on Wednesday and then higher tariffs coming on August 1st. So can you fill us in and set the stage? What is happening and what can we expect this week?
Well, I think you're right to pivot from tax to trade. I think that's exactly what the administration will be doing, with a big focus on trade, lasting at least this week and perhaps for the foreseeable future. Now, remember, there were some tariffs that had been paused that are due to reactivate on July 9th. There are also going to be some announcements as early as July 7th, maybe further on July 8th, that the administration has said would be forthcoming. It's not clear exactly which ones. He's already announced that there's some tentative deal with China. There's another deal potentially in place with Vietnam. We've heard of a host of other countries, whether that's India, Cambodia, even Japan. And that's not to say those will be the ones announced, just that those are some that have been in the ether as far as the conversation goes. And there might be a host of others. There was certainly a long line or a queue of countries that had apparently called the administration to negotiate. So we'll see if that materializes. I think there are two key things to look for. First of all, those specific deals and which ones are announced. But second, and more broadly, does that allow the administration to delay further the July 9th resuscitation of these tariffs? I think that would be a very big deal. I think markets would probably see that favorably if they find another way to delay that further and perhaps use the excuse of A, successful agreements that have already or are able to be announced, and B, others that are in the pipeline, if they can use that to say we're going to delay tariffs further. One other thing to note, recall that there had been a court case that sought to invalidate some of the president's use of IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, as a tool for imposing tariffs. That lower court decision will be heard by an appeals court, and that has been scheduled for September 30th, so we still have a little bit of time before that plays out. In the meantime, the administration is apparently going to be undertaking some actual longer, more cumbersome trade investigations, which themselves could lead to the imposition of tariffs. So it's a longer, more drawn-out process, but it could potentially, if it leads to tariffs, be more durable than the use of the IEEPA emergency powers. So lots on the table, and we'll see how this plays out both this week and in the coming months.
And a lot of dates and deadlines on our radar, so we will follow up on this. Chairman Camp, any comments on what's happening with trade and tariffs?
Well, a lot of companies are looking at this July 9th deadline, and Secretary Bessent said over the weekend that if agreements weren't agreed to by August 1, that there might be a snapback to those higher tariffs. So that seems to indicate there might be a later date than the July 9th date in discussions. And of course, these aren't really trade agreements in the sense that I used to think of them as when I was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the Congress. These are really top line agreements in a sense, because a true trade agreement takes months and often years to negotiate. They're incredibly detailed in nature. So these will be sort of memorandums of understanding with these countries, and we'll have to see where they move forward. And also over the weekend, the president mentioned something about a 10% tariff on BRICS countries. And that is something that we'll have to watch going forward, as they're having a BRICS meeting in Rio de Janeiro this week.
Chairman Camp, always great to see you and get your insight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Great to see you both.
And for our viewers, Week in Review is back this Friday, and you'll find the latest PwC tax insight about the new tax law linked in the description of this episode.
And thank you, as always, for joining us. We hope you have a great week. Take care.